In 1914, the world stood at a crossroads. On the surface, the empires of Europe were at their peak, elegant, powerful, and seemingly stable. Kings sat on golden thrones, streets were alive with music and laughter. Everything looked perfectly fine. But beneath that thin veil of gold and silk, something dark was quietly rotting. Old rivalries, secret alliances, armies sharpening their swords behind closed doors. In the dusty streets of Sarajevo, a single moment of fate was waiting. Archduke Franz Ferdinand stepped into an open car, unaware he was driving toward the end of an era. A wrong turn, a stalled engine. 2 shots rang out. Just 2 shots, and the silence of the century was shattered forever. What started as a regional tragedy quickly spiraled into a global nightmare. The gears of secret alliances began turning, pulling nations into a trap they had built themselves. Austria-Hungary struck first, declaring war on Serbia. Like dominoes falling, the giants woke up. Russia mobilized. Germany marched with cold precision. France prepared for the inevitable. Britain watched Belgium burn and made its decision. Within weeks, the borders of Europe were bleeding. Ambassadors packed their bags. Diplomacy died quietly in empty rooms. Nobody truly wanted this, and yet nobody stopped it. The machinery of war had been ignited. Trains were already moving, carrying millions of young men towards something none of them could imagine. There was absolutely no turning back. Bittersweet, nostalgic. Across the countryside, young men stepped forward, fueled by nationalism and the thrill of adventure. Boys who had never left their villages. Boys who had spent their lives on quiet farms, dreaming of something greater. Now they wore crisp new uniforms. They smiled for photographs. They kissed their mothers and climbed onto trains heading toward glory. "Home by Christmas," they laughed from the windows. Their mothers waved from the platform. Some smiled. Most did not. Because mothers understand things that young men don't. They know that glory is a story told by those who will never fight. They know that boys who leave on trains don't always return. But the trains were already moving, and those boys were already gone. The battlefield was no longer a place of grand maneuvers. It became something uglier, something permanent. These were the trenches, miles of jagged ditches carved into the mud, stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a new kind of hell that no textbook had ever described. Between the opposing lines lay no man's land, a desolate wasteland where grass was replaced by barbed wire, and the air carried the permanent smell of decay. To move forward was to face 1,000 rifles. To stay still was to wait for the shells. There was no good choice, only survival. 1 hour at a time, in a hole in the ground, listening to the earth shake around you. The war had stopped moving, but the dying had only just begun. Life in the shadows. Gritty, visceral. Life inside the trenches was a slow descent into madness. It wasn't just the enemy that killed you. It was everything around you. Cold water rose to your waist and stayed there for days, rotting the flesh on your living feet. They called it trench foot. Rats the size of cats ran across sleeping soldiers in the dark, bold and fearless, fed well by the fallen. Disease spread through the damp tunnels like fire. But the worst part wasn't physical. It was the weight. The constant crushing fear that at any second, without warning, a mortar shell could erupt beneath your feet and bury you alive in the very mud you stood in. That fear never left them. It lived in their chest, every hour, every minute of every single day. Industrial, terrifying. Technology had outpaced human courage, and the results were catastrophic. The machine gun changed the rules of war forever. One weapon, operated by just a few men, could fire hundreds of rounds per minute and stop an entire regiment dead in its tracks. The age of the heroic charge was over. The age of courage meeting courage on an open field, finished. What replaced it was mechanical, cold, and completely without mercy. Brave men climbed out of their trenches at the sound of a whistle, running forward, and were cut down like wheat before they took 20 steps. Yet the generals, sitting safely behind the lines, kept sending them forward. The orders never changed, the tactics never evolved, and so the cycle of slaughter repeated itself, day after bloody day after bloody day, haunting, breathless. Then came a horror the world had never seen before. It didn't arrive with a bang, no explosion, no warning, just a soft, ghostly yellow-green cloud, drifting slowly on the morning wind toward the trenches. Poison gas. Soldiers looked up and saw it coming before they understood what it was. Then the screaming started. Men scrambled for masks, soaking rags in water, pressing them desperately to their faces, gasping for one clean breath. But there was never enough time. It burned through the lungs like liquid fire. It blinded the eyes permanently. It blistered the skin from the outside in. In a gas attack, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The enemy had turned the very air we breathe into a weapon of mass destruction. Aggressive, loud. If the gas was the silent killer, the artillery was the screaming monster. Day and night, without pause, the ground shook with the impact of millions of shells. The horizon burned orange with constant explosions. The earth was pulverized into a moonscape, craters upon craters, stretching as far as the eye could see. This was the steel rain. Many soldiers spent their entire war never once seeing an enemy soldier. They only ever saw fire falling from the sky above them. Weeks, months of constant vibration, deafening noise, and shaking earth. It broke them. Not just their bodies, but their minds. Shell shock, they called it. Men who couldn't speak. Men who couldn't stop shaking. Men who were alive, but no longer whole. The earth itself seemed to be screaming. By now the fire had jumped far beyond Europe's borders. From the burning sands of the Ottoman Empire to the jungles of Africa, from the mountains of Gallipoli to the islands of the Pacific, the war had become something truly global. Colonial troops from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa were shipped to battlefields in countries whose names they had never heard spoken aloud. Men from the deserts of Senegal fought in the frozen mud of France. Boys from the mountains of Nepal stormed beaches at dawn. This was no longer a dispute over one archduke's death. It had transformed into a total war for the future of the entire planet. Resources, food, and lives were being consumed from every corner of the globe. No nation, no people, no continent was truly safe anymore. While the land had collapsed into stalemate, the oceans became something even more terrifying. A graveyard. Beneath the cold, dark waves, a new predator emerged. The German U-boat. Silent, invisible, patient. These submarines moved like ghosts through the deep, striking without any warning. Merchant ships carrying food, medicine, and supplies were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic in minutes, their crews given no time, no chance. The ocean, once a bridge between nations, became a place of absolute paranoia and dread. No journey felt safe. Passengers wrote farewell letters before boarding ships. The terror rising from the deep brought the war crashing to the doorsteps of the Americas, as casualty lists began including civilians who had died thousands of miles from any battlefield. The American. Entry tone. Hopeful, powerful. By 1917, the Allies were on the edge of collapse. 3 years of relentless slaughter had bled them white. French regiments were mutinying. Morale had shattered. The trenches were filled with men who had forgotten what hope felt like. Germany could sense it. Victory felt close. And then, the sleeping giant woke up. The United States entered the war, bringing something the Allies had almost forgotten existed: hope. Fresh troops poured into French ports by the hundreds of thousands, young men who hadn't spent years in the mud. American factories roared to life, producing weapons and supplies in staggering quantities. The doughboys arrived with energy the weary European armies hadn't felt in years. The balance of power began to shift, and Germany's momentum finally started to crack. Even as victory became imaginable, the cost of reaching it was destroying civilization from the inside. In the east, the Russian Empire imploded. Starving workers and exhausted soldiers turned against the Tsar in violent revolution. Russia signed a humiliating peace and withdrew from the war, desperate to save itself from total collapse. Across Europe, banks were empty. Streets were filled with hollow-eyed people searching for food that no longer existed. 3 centuries of royal dynasties, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, were crumbling simultaneously into dust. The old world order was dying, not just in the trenches, but in the hearts of ordinary people who had simply had enough. Enough blood, enough loss, enough grief. Enough. Spring 1918. Germany was starving. Its allies were collapsing. Time was running out. So they gambled everything. Every available soldier was pulled from the Eastern Front and hurled westward in one massive, desperate offensive. The Spring Offensive. All or nothing. For one breathtaking moment, it worked. German stormtroopers broke through lines that had held for years. They advanced faster than anyone had moved on the Western Front since 1914. Soldiers could see the distant towers of Paris on the horizon. Allied commanders prepared for the worst. But the push slowed. Supply lines couldn't keep up. Exhaustion set in. Allied counterattacks pushed back hard. The lines held. And as the sun set on Germany's last great advance, a quiet realization spread through the ranks. The war was lost. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of relentless, earth-shaking noise, the quiet came suddenly, and it felt wrong, unreal, almost impossible to understand. Men crawled slowly out of their holes, blinking into the pale November light. They looked across the mud and wire at the men on the other side. Not enemies anymore, just survivors. The Armistice had been signed. The war was over. But there were no celebrations in the trenches, no cheering, only exhaustion, disbelief, and a grief too deep for any words. The world that emerged from the smoke was unrecognizable. Maps were redrawn, empires dissolved, and the true cost was written permanently into the hollow faces of every man who walked away. When the counting was done, the numbers were almost too large for the human mind to hold. 17 million dead, 20 million wounded. An entire generation, poets, teachers, fathers, sons, swallowed by the mud and never returned. Cities lay in ruins, economies had collapsed, and the invisible wounds, the ones that don't show on the outside, would quietly poison survivors for the rest of their lives in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. They called it the war to end all wars. We know now it was only the beginning. World War I left scars on the soul of humanity so deep that we are still, in ways we don't always recognize, living inside them today. We remember, not for the